everyone, and welcome to Between the Prompts, the show where we explore how AI is reshaping teaching and learning. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Melissa. We're both educators who are curious, sometimes skeptical, and always excited about how AI is showing up in education and beyond.
Each week, we'll dive into a topic that's on our minds, and probably on yours too, whether you're a student, an educator, or just trying to make sense of all the AI buzz.
Today we're asking, what does it mean to be a learner in the age of AI? And I think to start to answer that question, Vanessa, I'm going to ask you, what does it even mean to learn today?
Oh, what does it mean to learn? I think that people have this perception of learning, and this is based on my experience of years of teaching people about learning. As soon as I say the word learn, people tend to conjure an image of school and sitting in a classroom with a teacher at the front of the room, and this idea that the teacher is somehow in charge and is going to give knowledge to the student. So it's that standard transmission model of a teacher or expert who has knowledge and they're going to give it to the learner. So what does it mean to learn? Learning is about receiving that knowledge or skill and then being able to perform it on your own. And I think that that's what a lot of people walk around with as the idea of learning. But I also have to say, I like to challenge that. I like to point out to people that walking around the world and paying attention to the world is usually an act of learning. We learn little things all day long, every day, as we walk around and make connections like, oh, I didn't know that it worked that way. Oh, I didn't realize that the leaves of this tree also turn colors in the autumn. Those are small acts of learning that occur.
Yeah, and I think it's something even before we moved into conversations about generative AI that we as educators were beginning to question and to rethink as well. And so much of the work that's been done recently is focused on how learning is actually a reflection of how we're creating meaning in the world around us and how we're able to problem solve and deal with situations a little differently than what we would see before with just rote memorization or being able to recite what information had been given to you. So it's really kind of an evolving definition of learning. And so I think for our conversation around generative AI, do you think that AI is changing the way students learn?
I think that I'm going to say no. It's not changing the way that students learn, or at least from the perspective of learning theory. And no, I'm not going to go into a whole lesson on learning theory, but we have different theories about how people learn. And I think that remains the same. But I will say that I think AI can help people learn in different ways. It doesn't change the underlying process that happens for learning, but AI can enter the scene and it can take different roles. So I like to go back to Taylor's work this is going back to 1980. So this is going back a long time. But when computers were starting to become prominent in classrooms, not as prominent as they are now, but schools were buying computers and starting to experiment with what they could do. Students knew what computers were. We're thinking, what is this tool? How is it going to manifest in the classroom? And Taylor said we could think of the computer as a tutor, a tool, or a tutee. So if we think about the tutor component of it, that it's going to be actually tutoring the student in how to do something. And I think about that a lot now. Any sort of personalized learning that we have in there, and it is going to adjust to exactly what the student needs. When we think about using it as a tool, we're thinking about just the same way that I use my word processor as a tool. It's something that's going to help us get the job done, whatever the job is. I use it as a tool all the time. And we think about it as a tutee, we start to think about the learner learning through the process of teaching to somebody else or something else, because we've got AI, the non-human agent here. And that was, in Taylor's world, that was with programming. And so kids were learning to program, they were teaching something else how to do something, and they were learning in that process. With AI, I don't want to add on to it, though, this idea of the collaborator, because AI can be your collaborator in learning if you really get into a rich dialogue with AI. And so I think that AI can function in all of those roles. I'd like to point out that an educator, a human educator, also can serve as your tutor, can serve as your collaborator, could be a bit of a tutee, because we could say, teach me, show me what you know by teaching it to me. I don't want to call the human collaborator a tool. That doesn't quite seem appropriate there. But then we have tools that we use. So it's just something that's very multifunction.
Yeah, and I think along with that, something that we can consider is how AI has started to perhaps change the expectations of learners. So you mentioned personalized feedback, and I think there is really something to that the AI tools can be a just-in-time opportunity for students to learn. And it really can be something that is able to meet the students where they are. Of course, if they understand how to engineer the prompts and know what they're looking for, but really the work that for so long would take a lot of work behind creating scenarios and creating these personalized learning pathways. Now it seems as though students, because of their interactions with AI, they can create those pathways themselves. They can use the support and the collaboration of the AI tools to come up with new scenarios, to invite in questions for quizzing, to think about things from other angles. So it really does give us this opportunity to think about the expectations of learners now, and that learning and content doesn't have to be static. So I think that dynamic piece that's coming in with AI is something that has really changed the expectations of learners. Have you had that same experience?
Well, I feel that it really changes this notion of what it means to study, what it means to do work outside of the formal classroom space. But I also wonder if students are able to effectively ask AI to do these things. So it's one thing to have an AI tool that has been designed explicitly for a process, like quizzing students and adapting to them. But if we're talking about students just figuring out that they want to use AI as some sort of homework or study buddy on their own and trying to go into their favorite LLM-based tool and make something happen, I don't know how well they know how to do that at this time. And I'm thinking about being in a classroom full of pre-service teachers and suggesting that they could use ChatGPT to help them with lesson planning and watching what they did. And any number of them, I remember one just typed in lesson plan, like as if something was going to happen. And yeah, they got a lesson plan, but it wasn't on anything specific. Now, AI has improved too. And so now it would say, it seems like you want a lesson plan. What a fabulous idea, because everything's a fabulous idea in AI. What would you like a lesson on? But to me, that's something that students need to learn how to do in order to have these successful AI experiences. So I'm thinking, what do you think? What are the skills that learners need now that they didn't need before?
Sure. I think one of the first ones we can talk about, we actually addressed from the educator perspective in our previous episode, where we talked about prompt literacy and prompt engineering. And what you were really getting at, I think, is some of the metacognitive practices for our student learners and helping them to develop those skills as humans first before they can use the AI tools in ways that are effective at creating learning pathways and at offering them the right types of feedback. So I think a big question we have is the prompt literacy. Just like you mentioned with the pre-service teachers, this is a skill, and it's a skill that has to be taught and then practiced and applied in all of these different situations. So much that we see with prompt engineering, it's an iterative process. I don't think any of us get it right the first time when we're trying things out. And we can see how much just changing the question will yield a completely different output from the tool that we're using. So there are some other skills that I think are going along with using these tools. It's a lot of the same skills that we've focused on for a long time in learning. So are students able to have this iterative practice where they're constantly refining and thinking through how to get the best results? It reminds me so much of when we're taught to research and how to work with information literacy. It's a very similar process that takes time, and it takes so much practice. And I think there are some other critical pieces as well, in addition to just the prompt engineering. So, Vanessa, do you have any thoughts about some of these critical pieces that come in with AI literacy now?
Yeah, I do. But I want to pick up on what you're saying about the iterative nature of this. I think that's something that we perhaps need to do a better job of emphasizing the importance of it. I love how you mentioned the research component of that, because over my years of of teaching research skills, I've had so many people come to me and say, I did a library search. Nobody's ever done anything on this. And I think, no. You need to do another search and another search, and you need to refine the search. And people give up. And I think the same thing can happen with AI. I worry sometimes, or we hear a lot about students who are just dropping their assignments into an AI tool. And so taking the instructor prompt and using the instructor prompt as an AI prompt, and then taking the output that they get. And I wonder the degree to which they continue to work with the AI tool to shape the output that they get. Not that I advocate them putting the instructor prompt in and trying to get work, but I think it's often an act of just dropping something in and taking whatever they got out of it, and not thinking more about what could or should be done. And maybe that actually taps into some of these other literacy, these issues that we have, like AI literacy, and evaluating content for accuracy, because this assumption that if you just dropped a prompt right in, that what you're going to get out of it is going to be accurate and is going to actually meet the needs of your assignment. I mean, that could be totally wrong. It could not be what is being asked for in your assignment. And if you don't have the expertise yourself to assess it, that's a real problem. Also thinking about the bias that's inherent. So the large language model has been trained on certain texts, and whatever text it has been trained on are going to influence the nature of its response. So if it's been trained all on text from one country or another, for example, you might get responses that are really focused toward things that are culturally relevant in that specific context. It's not going to be able to shift around effectively. Being able to look at the responses from AI and identify whether or not it's accurate or whether or not there's a particular bias, and then knowing how to try to adjust that or to shift around to teach it. Right? So now this is where you get to treat it as your tutee a little bit and say, no, this isn't accurate. So you would actually be telling it something like you're the teacher. That's actually a powerful learning moment when you can look at something that is inaccurate and respond, this is not accurate. But do our learners have the ability to do that? That's a critical literacy for them. And I keep coming back to this idea of metacognition and really understanding how they learn, what they need out of this, because again, there's so much we could do with AI, but if we're limiting ourselves to dropping in an assignment-based prompt and trying to get the so-called right answer, then we're really missing the boat, I think, on what could be done. But then, like, how do we get students to develop these metacognitive skills? What do you think about that, Melissa?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a little, what's different now, I think, with the generative AI tools compared to how we were helping to support some metacognitive practices before, especially when we're talking about looking at bias and looking at accuracy, is now we have a responsive tool. And so as you mentioned, it's going to reply to you however you're prompting it to respond. And so now I think it's this question of understanding the dialogue that's existing between the student learner and whatever tool that they're using. And so it's this reciprocal relationship that we see. So not only will the student need to be able to understand the accuracy and even the scope and the breadth of the responses, but if we're also suggesting that students can use this as something tutoring them, they also have to be able to understand the responses that the tool is giving to them based on their criteria. So it becomes this constant evaluation that has to happen for the output to be what we need it to be and for what the student is submitting as their type of assessment to really show up. So I think it actually adds another layer to metacognitive practices, because now it's not only thinking about how they're learning and evolving and growing and presenting the information, but now they also have to think about how the tool is doing this same thing and is responding to their request. So it becomes this extra practice of where they're almost having to apply these metacognitive practices to what they're receiving. And I think that's a little bit of a different situation than we've seen before.
Yeah, and now you've got me thinking about how, in this context, AI is effectively serving as a collaborator. But does the learner see AI as a collaborator, or is the learner putting the AI tool in the position of being the expert? And if the learner is seeing AI as their collaborator, then how does that change things? Because I'm thinking about when you put students in peer groups, there's often a lot of suspicion of whether or not their peers know the right answers or are going to lead them astray. So much stress about that part of it, and what's it going to do to their grade? What's it going to do to their learning process? If students thought of AI as a tool that is really a collaborator that they need to work with in dialogue and that could have the wrong answer, I wonder how they would feel about working with it on their assignments, if they would feel a little less confident or a little less likely to do it.
Right. And it's even with peer review. So when we're looking at peer groups, one of the things that we as educators have to do is we have to also step in and ask them to reflect on this process and to, in some ways, justify whether or not they've made changes based on the peer feedback. We see this at every level. We see it with students going through this. We know this from the publishing world. We have to make these choices of whether or not we're going to take the feedback we're receiving. And so I don't see this as something different, but as a continuation of that same skill set. And something that we as educators, just like we would teach students to reflect on their peer feedback, maybe this is where we also need to come in and ask them to reflect on the feedback that's coming from the AI tools. And I think that could have some perhaps unintended positive consequences, because it will just reinforce that what they're receiving may not be exactly the answer that they're looking for. It may not provide the type of response they're seeing, but that's a very different process than just taking whatever AI has given you and saying that this is the correct answer. So I think it's all part of this learning process, and it's just we're introducing a new piece of that now.
So it seems to me like we have more questions than we have answers right now. So what big questions do we still have about learning with AI?
I think that probably one of my biggest questions is, are we going to become over-reliant on AI? And that is, we could ask that question just as a big cultural, societal question. But in terms of learning, do we need to worry that we're going to become over-reliant on tools like generative AI?
I'll say that some of the early research in this area that I've seen, some of the neuroscience stuff that looks at what people's brains are doing when they're problem solving independently versus when they're problem solving with AI, it's a little bit scary to think that we're not exercising our full brains and to wonder what consequences that may have for us. So there could be some issues with over-reliance, but also just you're not always going to have it right there and be able to access it. I was visiting a school this week, and guess what? My always connected self couldn't be always connected, right? I'm not on their Wi-Fi network by default. My phone doesn't work effectively when I'm in that setting. I don't know, those thick walls, they just block out the signals. And I couldn't consult AI in that moment. It's not always going to be available to you. So over-reliance is definitely something for us to worry about. And yet the somewhat ubiquitousness of it in our lives, I think, is appealing from this perspective of lifelong learning. Like, what is lifelong learning going to look like? Especially if we are able to help people learn how to use AI effectively, independently, with, metacognitive skills and so on. What are the possibilities in lifelong learning?
Yeah. And, as you said, that there are some opportunities that are coming with this, going back to the idea of the tool being a collaborator. So all of these different topics and these different ideas of how to brainstorm new questions, that I think that really could lead to a lot of lifelong learning happening in terms of going in directions that people may not have gone before. But I want to kind of touch on something you mentioned with being at the school and not having access, right? So, I can't help but wonder as well, are we closing some of the learning gaps and some of the accessibility gaps, or do you think that AI, like some of the other tools, are widening those gaps?
Oh, that is a great question. And I think along multiple dimensions, not just this dimension of people who have access to the tools and who don't have access to the tools. And some are free, or they're free right now, but will they always be free? And will the best ones be free? Are the best ones free? They're not. Are the specialized ones free? Not necessarily. Or what are you giving up each time you use the tool? in terms of your own data and your own privacy. Ooh, we'll have to talk about that another day, won't we? But I also think about this widening or narrowing of learning gaps in terms of what people are able to do on their own, connecting back to metacognition. It feels like we just keep going back to metacognition over and over again.
Yeah, and I think too, in terms of just access with where we are now, I know you and I, we both attended an AI conference a couple months back. And one of the big takeaways from that conference was that as we address some of these questions, schools, educators, they all have different approaches and ideas about AI right now. And so we do have questions in terms of how much guidance are we providing students, and are students who are not being provided this guidance like we've been discussing in this episode, if we don't have educators in place or if we don't have institutions that are supporting this, in some ways, are we creating disadvantages by not also teaching things like AI literacy and writing prompts and how to use these different tools? So I think we do have a couple big questions still to ask around this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just kind of brainstorming out some of the other questions that I've got, or like, what is it that we're going to value about learning, and what are we going to end up valuing about AI? Is it going to be our place for quick answers, or are we going to end up going to it for deep answers? I don't have the answer to this right now, but I do wonder about it. I've also thought a lot about expertise, and I've wondered if there's a sweet spot of expertise that's needed. And I'm not just talking about that AI literacy expertise, but actual content knowledge expertise that is necessary to be able to effectively evaluate the responses that you get from AI. And especially if you're working, let's say, at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, you're doing analysis work, evaluation work, you're creating new things. How much of that subject matter area expertise do you need to have to be able to effectively evaluate and make use of the responses that you're getting from generative AI?
Yeah, and I think these are some of the big questions that we're still tackling. And I think part of our big takeaway from our conversation today really is looking at how learning and using AI, it requires good metacognitive skills in the similar ways that we've talked about with learning in general. And it involves a lot of different people being a part of this process, from strong educators, strong designers, people who are building out these environments. And it just really relies on this idea that learning is a process, and now we're introducing a new tool into this process. So I'm curious, and I think you and I would like to ask some of our listeners, what are you learning from AI, and what triumphs and challenges have you had? We'd love to stay connected, so subscribe to the podcast, share it with a colleague, or send us your questions and topic ideas. And don't miss our next episode, where we'll dive into how AI is being used for assessment.